Good morning, everybody. My name's Chris. I am a clinical psych grad student. Got one semester left this summer, and I'll be off to do bigger and greater things. That's what they tell me anyway. So I study differentiation, sex desire, pornography, things like that, in part of my program. And I did this research with Dakota Scott and Dr. Bequist in the psychology department. So basically, I found this study last year, kind of excited me. They looked at Portuguese couples and their this personality construct called differentiation, which I'll explain in a second. And they found that when people are more different on certain aspects of this differentiation, they have lower sexual desire with each other. And then as they get closer together, as they're more similar, they tend to have higher sexual desire. So let's go into what differentiation is. It has 4 factors. It was originally developed by, the idea of it was developed by this guy named Murray Bowen in the 50s, who's sort of considered the father of marriage and family counseling. So he noticed that there was this pattern in couples where they would tend to fuse together emotionally. They would sort of lose their identity and they would become a couple instead of remaining like an independent agent. And so he looked into it and he thought that was a bad thing, that, you know, if you were really like codependent with your partner, then you tended to have a lot more distressing life events. You weren't as good at handling change, things like that. But it wasn't until the 90s that Elizabeth Skowron actually did empirical research on differentiation, and she found that there are 4 factors that go into it. So there's emotional reactivity. It's self-explanatory, like the tendency to react emotionally when something happens to you. If you're stressed out, you have an outburst. Then there's fusion with others, and this is more of the core principle of differentiation, that you become enmeshed with someone and you aren't really able to figure out, like, who am I versus who is my partner. Kind of when you're fused, if your partner has a bad day, you are having a bad day, regardless of what has actually happened to you. But if your partner has a good day, then you're having a good day. The I position is the ability to put yourself first, to remain independent, to say, this is who I am, this is how I feel. My partner feels a different way, I empathize, but I am myself. You can tell if somebody has a good sense of I position if they state an opinion in the first person. I believe that blah, blah, blah. I believe the space program is good. I believe it is not, whatever it is. People with poor sense of I position tend to place that responsibility on other people. Well, research shows that the space program is good. My friend says that it's bad. They don't take responsibility for their opinions. And then emotional cutoff is, at first glance, it looks mature. If you're really overworked, if you're stressed out, if you're bothered by something, you take yourself away from the situation. You cut off someone else because you are too emotional. It is immature because you are not facing the problem. You're not facing the stress that you're feeling. You're just kind of running away from it. So, that idea in mind, they measured these Portuguese couples a couple years ago, and they found that when people are really different in differentiation, they tend to have really low sexual desire. So, they used the Hurlburt inventory of sexual desire, which is just a kind of a measure of libido. It's 25 questions, and it's just, I feel like having sex. I fantasize about my partner. Just kind of normal sexual desire questions. It's not like it doesn't really differentiate between my desire for my partner or my desire in general. It's just an in general type questionnaire. So here's a graphic explanation. When here's partner A, here's partner B. When they're really different, they don't have a lot of sexual desire together. But as they get closer together, it doesn't matter if they're both really high or really low. As long as they're close together, they tend to have high sexual desire. So in our study, we found 38 couples, 1 trio. And this is worldwide data, so then we pulled it, we trimmed it down to just the 29 people from Canada and America. Average age was 31, give or take 10 years. The number of sexual partners was kind of interesting because the average was 16 and the standard deviation was 46 because two people stated they had 200 and 300 sexual partners, respectively. One was 49, one was 51, they were partners. So I think the median is probably a little bit closer to the actual, a normal, or the normal for this group at least. about 4 partners. 84% of them were from America, 15 from Canada. Most of them were atheist or non-religious, and then pretty much the rest were Christian or other. So we designed a survey, we put together the differentiation self-inventory from 2003, then the Robert Inventory of Sexual Desire from 92, and then our own demographic items to put people together. We posted these to Reddit, and so Reddit is a online message board, and then there are, if you're not familiar, there are different categories for different interests. We got permission to use the sex subreddit, which is just people who ask questions about sex. And then there's a sample size subreddit, which is people who volunteer to do research. And we were hoping to do a comparison between the two, but we only had like 5 people from the sample size people volunteer, and then we had 100 and something from the sex subreddit. So this is mostly just people who subscribe to the sex subreddit. We were asked to participate in the survey, we told them it was about relationship variables, took about 10 minutes. And then they had to create a passphrase with their partner so that I could link it up, because it's all anonymous data. I wanted a way to say, okay, well, this person is dating this person, or married, or in a relationship of some kind. So if I saw, Mr. McGee fit 45, and then, 2 days later somebody else did a survey and it said Mr. McGee 45, I knew that they were together. So then, you add up certain items of each scale, you get an index score, and then I looked at overall differentiation, added it all up for partner A and then partner B. If partner A had 100 and partner B had 120 on differentiation, the average would be 110 and the difference would be 20. And these are the 2 numbers that I used for my correlations. So basically we did not replicate the original findings. Our group did not have the same ideas about differentiation, because we were expecting that the difference would have, the difference in differentiation would correlate to the average of sexual desire. That we didn't find that. But the sub-factors differentiation, I was surprised initially. I was like, wait, so if they're more different in desire, in their sexual desire, they're more different in reactivity? I was like, oh, wait, that makes total sense. People who are really different in one area of personality are probably really different in another area. People who are not like their partners in one way are probably not like them in another way. Here are the ways that it turned out, and the correlations are not all that weak. So I thought that was interesting. But it was only for those 2 factors of differentiation. It wasn't for the other 2. It wasn't for overall differentiation. Just these small sub-factors. People who are more reactive tend to be with a partner who is also really reactive. People who are really codependent tend to be with other people who are really codependent. And so this is what that looks like as they grow further apart. They grow further apart. So, it's a problem in one way to our sample size, but it's also kind of a unique look at a specific population in another way. So if we look at the sexual desire levels of the original study participants, where they normed the data, they tested mothers and non-mothers to see if they were any different in their sexual desire. Turned out they were not, but they scored in the mid-50s. A year later, they tested men who had been diagnosed with hypoactive sexual desire disorder, and they tested their wives who took the test for their husbands. And so if you're diagnosed with hypoactive sexual desire disorder, you probably score somewhere in the 30s, and their wives, they overestimated a little bit in the 40s, still lower than the original study. And then when I say original study here being the Portuguese study, their participants scored in the mid-60s, and then ours were in the lower 70s. So people who subscribe to the sex subreddit tend to have higher sexual desire scores than other populations. So this is not really a comparable population, but it is a unique look at a specific population from North America who happens to have an interest in sex. They do not show the same patterns as the original participants. So I presented this at the Gender and Sexuality Conference in Wichita a couple weeks ago, and so I asked them, I was like, does anybody know anything about Portuguese culture? Like, maybe that has something to do with it. And we had one participant who was a second generation child of immigrants, and she said that they didn't talk about sex at all. They had no communication about that. It was cut off at the head. You know, he'd bring up sex, and it was, oh, no, leave. I don't want to talk about it. And it wasn't until she was in her teens and her mom became a nurse, and in her nursing classes realized the importance of sex education, and then started to talk to her kids about it. So there may be some cultural difference that if we don't talk about sex, if we don't know about it as much, you tend to have a higher sexual desire because you're close to your partner. You know, you're similar in so many ways. Yeah, sex is green. It's a good, green light. Good for it. Go for it. You know, it could be the Reddit culture. I wish we had more participants from the volunteer sample size subreddit so we could have sort of a baseline, but didn't work out. And then I had another person in the audience who said that maybe the age of the participants and the number of sexual partners, maybe you get to a point in your life where you're like, I know what I want. I know what I want from my sex life. So their attachment, their enmeshment, differentiation with their partner is no longer relevant. Where it was relevant in the Portuguese people, maybe it's more about life experience. We had a higher average number of sexual partners, so maybe that had an effect on it. Maybe it's not about your interest, but about your experience with different people. So it's a nice look at individual, at this individual population, not really expandable to other populations. It's just something to keep in mind. A lot of sexual desire stuff with differentiation is kind of hit or miss. I think there's a problem with the original differentiation survey because it's very focused on family relationships and family dynamics. And the theory is your family of origin kind of helps shape your romantic behaviors. You see how your parents react to each other, so then you sort of apply those patterns to your romantic partners. But they're not the same. You don't show the same interactions with your parents as you do your lover. So I don't know that is the best measure of relationship dynamics, the differentiation stuff. So are there any questions?
I've got one. I'm just wondering how your demographics compared to the demographics of the original Portuguese.
Very similar.
Very similar.
Yeah, within a couple of years, as far as age goes, just a little older, just a few more sexual partners. The differentiation scores were very similar. The only real difference was the sexual partners and where they came from. So at first glance, it looks like a very comparable population, but then when you look at the number of sexual desires and the interest in sex on Reddit, that may have separated them enough. Anybody else? All right, thank you much.
Well, the next speaker is Alex Barnes, and he's going to be talking about the effectiveness of fall fire to manage invasive legumes, Cerisia lespedeza.
Hi there, thank you for coming. My name is Alexander Barnes. I'm here to present the effectiveness of fall fire to manage an invasive legume, Cerisia lespedeza. In invasive species management, there are two control methods that we use. One is biological, and this can be prescribed burning, mowing, or grazing. And the second control method is through chemical, and this is through herbicide application. Before we started this research, we want to know how exactly does fire affect other invasive species. Well, what we see is with Asian sword fern, kudzu, and salt cedar, we see a positive effect on the invasive species due to fire. But with Canadian thistle, false brome, and spotted knapweed, we see this negative effect in grassland systems. But with Canadian thistle and spotted knapweed in forested systems, we actually see an increase in seed production in forested systems. The current burn regimes that are done here in eastern Kansas and the Flint Hills region is done annually in the springtime. This is important in the removal of thatch from the previous year's growth. This has actually been shown to be ineffective at decreasing the seed viability in Cerisia lespedeza. The Cerisia seeds mature in the fall time, and the seeds fall to the ground in the winter. The spring burns actually help to scarify the outer coat on the seed and help to increase the germination of Cerisia. A little bit of history about Cerisia. It was imported into the United States in the 1890s into the Carolinas for soil erosion. and it was imported into Kansas in the 1930s. It can grow to be about 100 centimeters tall, and it is a very proliferate seed disperser. It produces about 195 to 385 kilograms of seed per acre, and that's about 160,000 seeds per kilogram. The range of Sericea is mostly found in the Midwest and Southeast. It's limited to the north due to temperature and to the west due to precipitation. This study was done back in 2007 by Allenbush, and we would actually expect to see the range of Sericea increase to the north just a little bit due to climate change. The site that we did our study was at Meredith National Wildlife Refuge in Lynn County, Kansas. It's about 20 miles east of Pleasanton, Kansas, on the Missouri-Kansas border. In our experiment, we looked at fall versus spring burning in conjunction with mowing, grazing, and litter addition and herbicide application. In this photo right here, we can see that we have a plot that we had in 2016 in the spring that we did. This was taken with a drone right before the fire was burning. It was actually occurring right as we were lighting the edges. In the top left corner, or your left, my right, we have our burn only treatment. This is our control. And the top left, we have our mowing. The mowing treatments were done every year in July. And in the bottom right corner, we have our litter addition. We did this about 2 weeks before the fire started, and we tried to spread the straw out as evenly as we could in this subplot. And then we also have our herbicide application. This photo was taken slightly after we were starting to finish up. You can still see a little bit of the fire still going, but mostly the fire has been pretty well extinguished. And the bottom two subplots, the litter addition and the herbicide application, we can see that the fire has gone all the way through these two subplots. Whereas in the top picture, we see that the fire has kind of gone through in patches or just in a strip. This is due to the fact that Sericea decreases litter depth and decreases fuel load for a fire. This is a term called mesification. So what exactly is mesification? Mesification was termed by Milwaukee and Abrams in 2008. It's whenever a widespread conversion of a fire-maintained open prairie is converted to a mesic forest. In this diagram right here, we see that pine trees are starting to infest an oak tree ecosystem. This actually helps to increase shadiness of the area, as well as create a cool, humid microclimate inside there, decreasing fire availability. In our research, we want to know how exactly is Sericea less used and influenced by secondary treatments. In our materials, we used a temperature-sensitive paint that ranged from 232 to 510 degrees Celsius. We chose 232 to 510 degrees Celsius because at 232 degrees Celsius for 2 minutes, this decreases seed viability significantly. Whereas at 510 degrees Celsius for a duration of fire, to significantly decrease seed viability, the fire needs to be there for about 5 to 10 seconds. In grassland systems, the fire moves very rapidly, so we'd want to see the fire actually hit that 510 degrees Celsius range. We set these plates at ground level to 300 centimeters at 50 centimeter intervals. And we took 1/10 of a square meter clippings at each pole, two sets of clippings at each pole. If the fire were to come at me and the pole is right in front of me, we're going to be taking clippings that a little bit behind the pole, so that way we're not decreasing the temperature and decreasing fuel load. The first thing that we looked at was the correlation of our variables. Usually in correlations, anything below 0.3 and above negative 0.3 is something that we don't want to use for our significant analysis in our principal component analysis, the test that we ran. What we saw is a positive correlation between burn treatment and season, litter depth and burn treatment, Sericea height and dry weight, Sericea height and moisture content, dry weight and moisture content, and ground level in 50 centimeters. Those are just some of the variables that we saw a positive correlation. But we did see a negative correlation at our Sericea height and grass height. This makes sense because if you start to think about it, if you have a lot of Sericea, you're not going to have a lot of grass. But if you have a lot of grass, you're not going to have very much sericea. So this negative correlation makes sense to us. The second thing that we wanted to look at was our initial eigenvalues. For initial eigenvalues, a total of anything less than 1 is a variable or a component that you don't want to use. So what we see is with the first 3 components that we had, we see our eigenvalue total of greater than 1. And actually our cumulative percent for those 3 values shows that there is around a 65% variation just from those 3 variables. Whereas 4 through 10, we don't see that much variation. And this just kind of shows that the components that we want to use is 1 through 3, and 1.0 was our cutoff line. For this talk today, to keep it short, I'm just going to talk about components 1 and 2. Component 3, I'll leave that for another day. But for component 1, we see an increase in moisture content is going to have a positive correlation with dry weight and sericea height. This makes sense because sericea has a lot of moisture. It helps to create a cool, humid climate, and we see a positive correlation with dry weight. Sericea weighs a lot more than the grass. And for component 2, we see that positive correlation for litter depth has a positive correlation for grass height. This makes sense. If you have more grass, you're going to have more litter. And so what we did is we went ahead and plotted the PC1 versus PC2. PC1 shows that our litter addition and our burn-only treatments, we see an increase in sericea, or a positive correlation towards sericea height, moisture content, and dry weight. Whereas for PC2, we see that for our herbicide and our mow treatments, we see an increase in litter height and grass depth, or grass height. So this kind of makes sense with what our correlation matrix was showing. So to go back to my research question, how is sericea or secondary treatments influenced by secondary treatments? How is sericea influenced by secondary treatments? Sorry. Well, we see that with the secondary treatments of burn only and litter addition, we see that there's an increase in sericea height, moisture content, and dry weight. But with the secondary treatments of herbicide and mow treatments, we see an increase in grass height and litter depth. So for our future research, we're going to be looking at the regression of the variables that are highly correlated. So those other variables that I didn't look at, we're going to put it into a simple linear regression and check to see how significant they are. And then we're going to be comparing the staining biomass of secondary treatments with stem counts of sericea to see how effective is our secondary treatments. I'd like to acknowledge USDA Fish and Wildlife Services at Merritt National Wildlife Refuge, the USDA SARE program for our funding, as well as the professors that helped me out with my statistical analysis, and my friends and family. Thank you. Great. Yeah.
You did your study over multiple seasons. Did you, and I came in late, so you may
Yeah, no, I saw it.
Did you look at the annual rainfall in those years and how it affected your results?
So there were a lot of variables. You're an old biology teacher. I've seen you around in biology seminar quite a few times, and I always dread you asking a question. But yeah, so in ecology, there's a lot of variables that we can't exactly take account for. Relative humidity, wind speed were things that we didn't take readings from the whole entire day. But we do have that data as well as the precipitation rates online, but we haven't factored that into our components.
All right, more questions? All right. Thanks, Alex. Talking about the effective integration approach on the employee attitudes through organizational culture change, HR initiatives after mergers and acquisitions.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Dea, and as mentioned before, this is the title of my thesis, kind of long, so you can go ahead and read on the slides. So mergers and acquisitions have been key strategies in our business world today. There are a lot of mergers and acquisitions happening, and in fact, in 2016, there were 48,000 of transactions with a total value of more than 3.6 trillion US dollars. But unfortunately, the success rate of these strategies is still disappointing. So approximately 80% of the transactions have failed to meet these shareholders' expectations. And why? The answer is actually the human factor. So if we take a look at the process here, usually at the first stage and the second stage, companies focus more on the financial and legal aspect. And then at the last stage, in the integration stage, the companies come together, and this is the core process of the cultural change. So this is the most important stage for HR function, especially because then we have two different organizations with two different values, like two different peoples and leaders come together and have like a new goals and missions and structures. So ELEs have summarized 4 different types of approach on mergers and acquisitions. We have the first one, preservation approach here. This is when the two companies keep their identity, so they keep their structures, their processes. And then we have absorption approach, in which the dominant company try to impose their culture into the smaller company. And then we have symbiotic approach. They're taking best practices from both organizations. They come into one new organization, and kind of the same, we have transformational integration, but they also integrate the best practices from external benchmarking and research. So past research have shown that this failure in integrating the two companies actually recognizes the biggest impediment or biggest challenge for the company to achieve successful mergers and acquisitions. This correlates with lower employee attitudes, and the involvement of human resource function is critical to achieve successful mergers and acquisitions. So we know that there are a lot of different variables plays some kind of a role in mergers and acquisitions, and we know the mergers and acquisitions have potential to achieve sustainable business growth and competitive advantage, but the relationship of these variables are rarely explained. So that's why I conducted the study to investigate the relationships between the integration approach and the employees' attitudes, which in the study is specified as the employee engagement and organizational commitment. And I would also like to see the organizational culture change and HR perceived effectiveness on the relationships. So I have integration approach as my independent variable here. And the dependent variable is the employees' attitudes. And I looked at the role of the organizational cultural gap as the mediator and HR perceived effectiveness as the moderator. So I did both quantitative and qualitative methods on 101 employees of a mining corporation in Indonesia. I did interviews with 4 HR managers, and the purpose of these interviews is actually to develop the surveys for the HR effectiveness. And then I sent the online survey platform, and I got them 101 to respond to my survey. So this is how the integration looked like in the company. They took 2 different approaches. The first one is the preservation, where the both company keep their identity. So this was applied to the mining sites because it's a mining company. They have different locations. This applies to the mining sites, and this applied to the headquarters. So the departments like finance, legal, all that kind of support and policymaker departments. And then I collected data from both groups and compared it to answer my research questions. These are the measures that I use, and I translated all of them from English to Indonesian because they don't speak English. So I did use the back translation methods. And before I go on into the results, I just want to touch on this quickly because I'm going to be talking about this a lot. So for the organizational culture, in this study, I used the framework of Cameron and Quinn. It's called the Competing Values Framework. So there are 4 different types of organizational culture based on this framework. The first one is clan. This is where the organizations feels like a family. So sense of we-ness is pretty high, and they are cohesive. They favors participation and development of the employees. And then we have hierarchical organizations in which they favor clear lines of authority, clear lines of decision making, and they favor efficient and effective processes. And then we have adhocracy. This is the most dynamic culture in which they really like innovation, they really like cutting edge products, and they keep moving very fast in this organization. And then the last one, we have market culture. This is the most stable, but the most customer driven. So it's very result oriented in this organizations. So I'm not gonna go into details on the correlational analysis for the 5 research questions, because I took 1 hour at the previous presentation for that. So I'm just going to show you the summary of the results that I got here. I got integration approach correlated with the perceived culture change. So I dummy coded 1 preservation approach for 0 and transformational approach for 1. So for people who underwent the transformational approach, they experience more culture change here. And then I got negative score here, meaning that the people in the transformational approach group experience lower engagement and lower commitment. And also I found that the perceived culture change partially mediates the relationship between integration approach and engagement and commitment, and that the HR effectiveness moderates the relationship between perceived culture change and employee engagement and commitment. So this means that HR effectiveness is playing a critical role here, and when they are effective, the perceived culture change would not lead to lower engagement or organizational commitment. So I looked a little bit further on how the change happened. So apparently in this case, in this company, they changed into less clannish culture and more market. So they became less friendly and more demanding. So that is also probably why that they had lower engagement and lower commitment. And I looked further into the correlations, and I found significant correlations between clan and market and employee engagement and organizational commitment is on the red here. And then I broke it down into preservation approach and transformational approach, and found another interesting findings that people in the preservation approach did not even have any significant relationship here. So the effect was stronger on the engagement and commitment from the clan and market change in the transformational approach. Also, I did a qualitative part also on the study. I added 1 open-ended questions by the end of the survey, and I found this 6 interesting themes from the employees, that they want more communication and coordination. Fairness is important for them. They want HR to pay attention to the employees' needs. They want more employee placement and development, and then they want more effective and efficient organizational structure. And the last one, they want to see the program's implementations, because they saw a lot of plans but not enough implementations. There are also other findings, other themes that occur from the qualitative part. And so this study, this results that I just showed you adds more to the current literature, that the integration process is an important part of the mergers and acquisitions, and this add to what kind of integration approach that might lead to positive and negative outcomes. So also the employees in the transformational approach perceived more changes in the organizational culture. And it is also interesting because transformational approach would probably not like a bad approach, but it's because of the lack of communication and coordination on the implementation that it became negative outcomes. And also it's interesting to note that the different types of change might have different impacts on the employee. So it's not even about the change, but it's about how the change happened. So because they experience it less clannish and more market, then the outcomes were more negative. So we don't know what's going to happen if the change was like more clannish or more adhocracy or less hierarchy. So that's why we need further research to look into that. And the biggest takeaway from this research is probably HR function. So HR initiatives have found to moderate the relationship. So it means that they can help to maintain employees' attitudes during mergers and acquisitions to some extent. There are a lot of practical implications, the recommendation that I would suggest, but probably the most important thing is to carefully consider which integration approach to take, involve HR from the very beginning, and probably involve organizational culture assessment at the initial stage, so not only the financial and legal aspect, and make sure that the HR function is ready because they're going to facilitate the change, so make sure that they have the capabilities and they are ready to manage the organizational culture change. Thank you.
Do you think your outcome would have changed if you were looking at an industry, say a software company versus a mining company?
I am pretty sure it will, yeah, because companies in this type of industry, it's a mining company, it's more clannish and hierarchical kind of, and in software or technological industry, we will see more adhocracy, probably more adhocracy culture, and the kind of change, as I mentioned before, probably will be different. So I will need to take a look at that in further research.
So for the mining company, you mentioned that there's certainly things that they could have done differently. Does this study matter for those companies that you studied, or is this only going to be relevant to future mergers?
This will be relevant for the company. Actually, when I'm going back home to Indonesia next month, I will be presenting these results to them and will provide some recommendations for them. And they are still, so the mergers happened in 2015 and they are still going through some processes right now. And this recommendation would probably help them for their HR initiatives. But also for further research, I think it's going to be very good for other organizations who are going to undertake the mergers and acquisitions. They would involve HR from the beginning and make sure that they are ready to change and take the integration approach fit for their organizations, kind of stuff like that. And there are actually some other things like do communications and make sure the fairness and everything. So it's pretty general.
All right, well, thank you. It is from Pardon Masober-Rambi, and he's going to be looking at there's a pilot study and an investigation to recover and to individualize vertebrate DNA from the GI tract of some domestic beetles.
Hello everyone, my name is Pardon. I'll be just highlighting some of the research findings that I got from such an investigation. Just maybe to simplify the topic, we just wanted to see what is inside the stomach of a flesh-eating insect using DNA. That's the simplified topic of this. So we used the flesh-eating insects for several reasons that I will highlight. So in this talk, I will just walk through the introduction, then we'll go to the set of objectives that we had and maybe the methodology that we used and also the results. I've combined my results with discussion for the sake of simplicity. Then from there we shall be able to see the conclusions from this study. So why did we do this study? According to the NAMUS, the National Missing Identified Persons, this is a system that was developed by the United States Institute of Justice, just to identify, to know how many people are missing, and maybe to be able to link with their causes, or maybe to be able to bring closure to the family or whoever is someone who is missing. So The recent statistics from this system, it highlights that approximately 29,000 people are missing nationwide. So from those 29,000 cases, open cases are 49. They have no clue of where these people are, while this maybe 51% have been closed. And in Kansas State, we have 193 people missing as of today. And of these 193 cases, only 56% has been the percentage that has been closed, and 44% are still open. That's why this research may be of much relevance to us. So, when we look at this photo, I'm sure it's clear, but I will just highlight some things that are of maybe importance to us. This is highlighting an air disaster that occurred in New York from American airline. It crashed just after taking off from JF Kennedy Airport, and it is so important to this research because that's where the idea came from. I will just explain in a minute why the idea came from this photo. So this airplane crashed, and we can see the people in white are firefighters searching for human remains. You can see them in their numbers. They're searching for human remains. And there are also several debris that is around this place, and things are mixed up in this case. So it may be difficult to fully identify who is missing. But in any case, we have to explain why people go missing. There are so many reasons why people go missing, and some of them are mass disasters like the one that we have seen, and acts of violence. Why do people commit such crimes? We may not know the exact reasons, but we know that such crimes may lead to someone to be out of the space that we live in. So the remains can be mixed together and may not be visually identified. Like we have seen the firefighters were in white looking for human remains. There's no doubt that the human remains were in pieces, and it was really difficult to identify them. So why did I say that this photo that I've shown you gave birth to the research idea? It was because of the phrase, the firefighters were looking for human remains. The question came as in, what if there are no human remains to look for? How can we identify these missing people? That's why I said this previous photo gave birth to this. So, as you can see in this photo, we can see investigators. They're investigating one of the cases. And in this case, we may not see any body remain, and we may not see anything that may be of distinct value. We can tell, or that we can tell that this can link someone who has committed a crime. But their presence and those markers that they have put, they show us that they are doing their job very well. So in this case, this is the idea, or this is an example when someone would go missing, and investigators may be aware of a place where this crime occurred. So if they are at this place and there is no human remain, there is no human flesh to look for, what should they do? Is it the reason why we have 44% and maybe 49% of cases that are still open because of missing human beings? Maybe or maybe not. So why are there these? Why sometimes the bodies may not be found immediately? There are several reasons to that. People commit crimes again for different reasons. Some may commit crime and try to conceal the evidence, maybe the body, to move the body from one place to another. That may be the reason why the body may not be found immediately. The other reason could be scavenging animals. We have here seen in that image where investigators were putting markers on the ground. Scavenging animals could come and take body parts of a human being and move from one place to another. So in that case, we may not have anything to look for and anything to use for closure of case or maybe to identify a missing human being. So our research is trying to shift the attention of investigators to look for something that is outside the scope, something that is not usually done, as we have seen by the firefighters who were looking for the non-human remains after an airplane crash. So in this case, the investigators can look for flesh-eating insects that would feed on flesh, and during transportation or movement by a scavenging animal or maybe a suspect, those flesh-eating insects may fall down. When they fall down at a suspected crime scene, there's a chance that when these investigators come to look for evidence, they can come and pick those flesh-eating insects and extract DNA. So remember the topic we said we want to recover, we want to see what is inside the topic, inside the intestines of flesh-eating insects. So if we are able to tell what these flesh-eating insects were feeding on, we can also be able to say or link whoever is missing to the crime scene. So these are a set of objectives that we postulated. We wanted to recover, to see if it's possible to recover DNA from the GI tract of flesh-eating insects, and maybe to generate profiles from these from the DNA recovered. And again, we know that these are flesh-eating insects, but our studies should incorporate human element, because those people who are missing are human beings. But it's really unethical to look for human flesh and feed on flesh-eating insects. But you shall see what we did in this study just to prove the point that it's possible to recover the DNA from flesh-eating insects. So why do we look at insects? Right. Another reason is that insects are the first kind of species that will get attracted to a decomposing body. And we did not specifically look at these flies or mosquitoes for several reasons, but we focused on these Dermestes maculatus. Those are the beetles that we use in this research. Flies are known to travel several miles in a day. So using these for this study may not be a good decision, because you don't know where to find this fly. But using these beetles, it's possible because they complete their life cycle. Whenever there is food, they don't move from place to place. And they're also large enough to be visually identified. That's why we chose these flesh-eating insects. So in our materials and methods, the stock colony, the one that we call the stock colony, the starting colony was ordered from Carolina Biological Company, and it was delivered in the Biological Science Department. It consisted of about 8 adults and 4 larvae. Usually from that stock we had to prepare using mouse food just to prepare the hot culture. That was for 14 days. After 14 days, we transferred equally the quantities of these insects into separate containers. When we separated when we put into separate containers, we fed them with individual meats like pork, beef, and we used also the poultry, which was chicken. So why did we do that? Because we know people are different. So using different kinds of meat, it was more like saying these are the people that were fed on by the insects. So we wanted to see if we can recover DNA from these flesh-eating insects. Again, in another experimental setup, we wanted to see if it's possible to identify or to recover human DNA from these insects. As we have said, it's unethical to feed insects with human flesh. What did we do? We asked for human blood, and fortunately 2 volunteers provided their blood samples, and that blood samples, or those blood samples, were mixed with beef. And after mixing with beef, we were exposed to these flesh-eating insects and see what would take place. So in other words, we also had the idea, since we wanted to see what they fed on, we wanted to target the GI tract. But when we discovered that the insects were very small, we had to look in other ways, as in how can we target only the DNA inside the GI tract. So we used Clorox, 10% Clorox, to disinfect the exogenous DNA. After disinfecting the exogenous DNA, whatever remained could be inside the GI tract. So Clorox is known to degrade DNA that is free, and also to get rid of any DNA that is not relevant. So these are species-specific primers that we used. Those are unique to every kind of meat. I'll just walk you through this is the summary again of the methods that we did. The colonies were like this. The Clorox was in this kind of container. Then we extracted DNA, the total DNA. After extracting total DNA using kits, we went on to do the PCR. That is just amplification of the small quantities of DNA. So these are the results of Clorox. That presence of band, it shows that the DNA that was swabbed from species of beetles that were not disinfected was present. But the other, we don't see any band, meaning that it was effective to disinfect the outside of beetles. So these results, lem C, as you can see, P and B, these are species-specific bands. Their presence signifies that, of course, the genes for pork, beef, and poultry were successfully amplified from the GI tract of beetles. Again, the human element that was introduced with the most quantity was this, and the least quantity was this. There is no relationship in this amount of quantity and time that was subjected to exposure because of random sampling that was done. So this is the profile that is used from the results that we got. The profile is the one that is applied in the CODIS, that is combined DNA index system that combines the computer and forensic science to provide investigative leads. So these gaps, they mean that it's not possible always to get DNA in samples. And there are several reasons to that: degradation or maybe low quantity DNA. So this is another way of representing the profile. And this is part of the full profile that we recovered from this DNA. And this shows how computer searches are done. This is a manual search whereby you can link the DNA that was found and the DNA that we know. So we have the reference sample and the sample that was recovered. So this is another also reference sample and the sample C that was recovered. It just means the same thing. So remember those gaps that were there. It means that it's not always the case that we find the DNA in this sample due to random sampling, but there's a chance of finding DNA inside the GI tract. So conclusions, for sure, we found out that it's possible to recover DNA. And we would like to thank the research grants and the biological science department for providing funds with, for this research to be successful. And also Dr. Melissa Bailey and Jara Kennedy. Some of my reference. So I will take any questions for now.
What is the probability of finding a beetle in, say, a forest or something? Do you have any idea of once the body has been removed, how long they would stick around? What the time frame you would have would be?
I would answer in two ways. What is the probability of finding beetles in the forest? The probability, I cannot quantify it for now, but maybe to rephrase your question, what is the probability of finding flesh-eating beetles in the forest? The probability is high whenever there's any carcass or any body that is within that environment. Again, to answer the second part of your question, how long does it take to recover DNA? In this experiment, on this pilot study, we assayed up to 72 hours, of which in a forest, there are things that we must bear in mind. In a forest, before we explain that, we can say we have said that whenever there is food source, the beetles will not move from one place to another. But when the food source is now scarce, that's when you see them flying around. So there's again a chance of life cycle. It spends about 60 days, the total life cycle of this beetle. So again, I was looking, remember when we did a validation study with Clorox, we found out that there was exogenous DNA around beetles. So that would be also relevant. We may not target the DNA inside the GI tract, but we may target the exogenous DNA, which is of relevance in this case. So how long does it stay in a forest? Blood stains have known to preserve DNA for more than 20 years, if I'm not mistaken, with the studies that I've done. So as long as there is no moisture, because moisture is the #1 enemy to DNA degradation, oxygen and water will degrade DNA, or maybe provide conditions for DNA degrading enzymes. So how long? As long as there are no things or maybe factors that degrade DNA, we can find the DNA on the beetles that would have been exposed to this flesh. And maybe lastly, if the beetle is in a concealed environment, how concealed it is, but if it's not exposed to UV light, we can find the DNA maybe in intact shell. But when it's exposed to UV light, there are high chances of degradation again.
Any other questions?
You looked at adult beetles, correct?
Both.
You looked at both, and you
Yes.
found no difference then between the larva and, did you get equivalent results between the two stages of the life cycle?
That would be an interesting study to look at. I did not look at the differences or variations. What I did, or what we noticed, is that the larvae are the ones that have high metabolic rates, and they tend to feed more on whatever the food source is available. So that would be an interesting question to answer in the future, as in looking at those.
Thank you very much.